So we'll begin by setting our motivation. So we try to bring those minds of faith and refuge and bodhicitta to mind. Wanting to study the Buddha's teachings, the wisdom of the sutras as condensed and organized in the Lamrim, due to our understanding of the power of the teachings, how they present a reliable and repeatable and easily followable inner technology for following in the footsteps of the Buddha. Like Venerable Rabina says, like following a recipe for our own enlightenment. One that has been tested for 2,500 years, found to be effective and powerful. And the purpose of accomplishing that is not only for our own benefit, but primarily to unlock our ability to be of benefit. To know the minds of other sentient beings, to be in a position to help. We cultivate those minds of refuge and confidence and bodhicitta. All right. So we've covered up through day 246 in the last class. Anything that's come up, questions, thoughts about what's been covered? So in the next couple of contemplations, Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa are going to kind of pull back a little bit and talk more about the sort of general process. We covered the 6 primary delusions in the last several contemplations, and now we're going to look at kind of the process of the arising of the afflictions in a little bit more general way. And so starting with day 247, Lama Yeshe is going to talk about, really the phrases aren't used specifically in the contemplation, but really it's the phrasing would be self-grasping and self-cherishing, kind of as he's talking about the way that we evolve into the root, the kind of individually definable, pride is different than attachment, which is different than anger, which is different than, deluded views and so on. They each have their own unique flavors. But the way in which the mind broadly moves into the afflictions is due to a kind of more primary causal chain of fundamental ignorance, self-grasping, and self-cherishing. So he says it's very important to recognize that all desire, hatred, and other delusions. So desire here is a way of translating attachment, the affliction of attachment, because not all desire, if we were to use desire in a more colloquial way, in a less technical way, Buddhism doesn't hold that all desires are afflictive. A person may desire enlightenment. A person may desire, to help in a given, even just conventionally. You see something happening and you desire to, without motivation, we would do nothing. We wouldn't get out of bed if some motivation didn't arise in the mind. So we might desire something, we might have a motivation, we might move toward an object, but we can do that in a reasonably less diluted. And of course, Buddhism would say until we directly realize emptiness, all of our actions are tinged with fundamental ignorance, even if it's a constructive, constructive or virtuous action. We still do it, grasping at truly existent I, truly existent action, truly existent other. And so generally that's why virtuous actions lead to higher rebirth, but they don't by themselves lead to enlightenment. They might help to create some of the beneficial causes and conditions for enlightenment, like a perfect human rebirth, access to the teachings, and so on. But they don't directly become a cause unless they're mixed, unless they're joined, with wisdom realizing emptiness and bodhicitta. Then they become really stainless kinds of karmas. But yeah, so just to say, that desire in that first sentence, when he says all desire, it doesn't mean all anything that we may be interested in or that we might want to move toward. Desire here is meaning the affliction of attachment. So attachment, hatred, and other delusions and problems that they bring come from attachment and ego. So, does attachment and desirous attachment, so we could say afflicted desire or, something along that line, come from attachment and ego. So if there's actually of the two, attachment and ego, it's ego that comes first. So this is where we start talking about self-grasping and self-cherishing. But the ego itself is the self-grasping, grasping at when fundamental ignorance is operative in the mind, fundamental ignorance apprehends body and mind, and then of course apprehends external phenomena. But the real, because the mind is the kind of receptacle of all of our, it is the motivator of all of our actions and is the receptacle of all of our sensory data, all of our sensory impressions. It's of primary importance that we don't just wrongly cognize external phenomena, we wrongly cognize the body and mind complex. And that is particularly disastrous because, as I say, it's the mind that generates karma due to wrongly cognizing not only the body and mind, but also all of the objects that we are in relation two. So the engine, if the mind wasn't the originator of karma, then maybe we could say that it's sort of equal, that we wrongly cognize body and mind, and we wrongly cognize external phenomena, but it's particularly a problem that we wrongly cognize the body and mind, because that is where karma is generated and the karmic seeds are laid down. And then that, that's the whole kind of process of actively creating samsara. So he says delusion starts with ego and attachment follows. So he says the concept of ego builds a projection of, quote, I, and paints that polluted projection with a veneer of qualities like I am, whatever. I'm industrious. I'm, good and bad qualities that we ascribe to ourselves. And so here, this is particularly, again, like I say, this right now is particularly focused on ego identity creation. We do the same thing when we cognize external phenomena. We paint a projection. It's just not a projection of the I, it's a projection of other. And then we also imbue that with a veneer of qualities, but that's just not what we're at right in this part. And then he says, when the I, superficial, artificial, and illusory, meaning here the false I, the I that was previously in quotes. So it's not just a bare recognition that there is body, there is mind, and they are connected. That's not a problematic version of the I. This is the false I, the projected, stable, kind of existing from its own side, self-supporting, self-sufficient, ego identity sort of I. Again, like he says, superficial, artificial, and illusory, starts looking. So now we're talking about this ego identity being in relation to that which is outside of the I, starts looking at the pleasures of the sense world. It labels certain objects as desirable. From this, attachment arises, sticking or clinging to these attractive objects. This, very briefly, is the evolution of attachment. So, in a way, self-cherishing is kind of maybe a little bit not so directly mentioned here. He, in a way, it almost sort of sounds like it's going from self-grasping to attachment, kind of skipping self-cherishing. But so self-grasping is just what he was talking about, that false, the creation of the false I, grasping at, you could say, like we talked about before, on Monday, the view of the transitory collection, grasping at that false identity. And then self-cherishing is holding any of the desires or wants or interests or thoughts or needs of the I to be paramount, to be of highest priority. And so, but the two go together, self-grasping and self-cherishing. It's well, yeah, no, I think we can, I go off on tangents sometimes. So for an ordinary person, self-grasping and self-cherishing, come together. Okay, well, maybe I can't help myself. So, they talk about with the arhats, for example, they don't really have So I was going to kind of say, well, for an ordinary person, self-grasping and self-cherishing, they're kind of unavoidably mixed. But it's a little bit more nuanced because they do say, kind of for an arhat, they don't really have self-cherishing, but there's this sort of still this subtle kind of imprint that's left of self-grasping, that is kind of is eliminated when the very, very subtle obscurations are abandoned, um, on the Mahayana path. But in the minds of an arhat, it doesn't prevent them from achieving individual liberation. But there's this kind of very, very subtle, self-grasping, that is still there. And so technically you could sort of have some degree of self-grasping without self-cherishing. But uh, for us, not really possible. When self-grasping is there, then self-cherishing comes. And of course, the problem with that phrasing is that self-cherishing sounds like a good thing, like we're kind of told to look after ourselves and to be kind to ourselves, and that isn't what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very narrow, very kind of putting ourselves above others. And Buddhism would say we should look after ourselves, but the best way to look after yourself is to get rid of your self-cherishing, because it really actually causes suffering, in our own mind, because it makes us so fragile, and to any kind of um, challenge. Yes, Felice.
Would self-cherishing be, or at least include, holding on to those concepts? Like there's a self-grasping, and then it's like, well, I'm really important because I am this, famous writer. I don't know, I'm just making something up, but these things I believe about myself make me really important.
I mean, that's particularly, kind of deluded pride, in a way. So maybe we could label that more so like deluded pride. Because self cherishing is a little bit more. Um, I mean, of course, because there is self cherishing, all of the afflictions arise. So it's directly related to deluded pride and to attachment and to anger and to, um, but it's kind of more in a way more fundamental, because it's just sort of because I want this, or because I think this, or it's really anything that has to do with what is happening to our body or our mind. um, any of that is given a level of primacy, that where like if I have a headache, it's a crisis, and I can't tolerate that maybe I ran out of Tylenol, or and I have to just I will stop talking to other. That's what I will fix. um but if someone tells me that they have a headache, then I'm like, oh, that's, I'm sorry, that's unfortunate. But then, like, but I don't necessarily, you know, stop what I'm doing, try to fix it, depending on what's happening, or because it isn't happening to me. I don't feel like, it's happening to the other person. And so it's um, that kind of overriding self self-interest or self-concern or selfish attitude, really. And it just sort of pervades all of waking life. And Geshe Sherab said, even in our dreams, we prefer not having a nightmare. We prefer, we can't even tolerate, a dream that where we were being chased, or we don't even have tolerance for that kind of adversity, even though it didn't happen. It's not even a real thing. Still, it bothers us when we wake up, and yeah. So Lama Yeshe says, the moment our ego says, quote, I, so again, this false, deluded I, we automatically identify ourselves as totally separate from other atoms, other people. On the basis of this view of two different things, self and other, we automatically see I as the most important one. Then, with attachment, our narrow mind chooses one particular atom as a source of sense pleasure. This then makes us view all other atoms as either irrelevant or as objects of hatred. And that's kind of a idiosyncratic way that Lama Yeshe kind of talks. This idea of, he's kind of, he's atomic is, I think atomic is kind of being used as discrete, it kind of just in a general sense, like in a way, like an irreducible mental construct. Sort of like when we look at our best friend, then it's best friend, and it's not neighbor. We look at our neighbor, we look at our best friend. One is neighbor, one is best friend, and so they're atomic in the sense that they become one thing, and they're not a table, they're not a chair, they're not they're kind of one label. I think that's generally what how atomic is kind of being used. Sort of the way like they use atomic note. If you like in the Zettelkasten method of note taking, like it's kind of one concept that can't be reduced further. It's sort of a simplified, kind of irreducible in that way, like one label. Um, uh, In other words, when we perceive the hallucination of the self-existent independent I, we immediately accept the existence of other. That other then appears as totally separate from us. If there were no I, there would be no appearance of other. But we build up that separateness, and this is where all the problems of samsara come from. All this is the work of ego, which is the product of ignorance. Ignorance causes ego. So fundamental ignorance, of course, is the beginning of the chain of causation. And then on the basis of fundamental ignorance, there's the false apprehension of body and mind that causes self-grasping, and then self-cherishing flows immediately from that. And then all of the other afflictions could be due to specific causes and conditions. Hatred will arise. When other causes and conditions are present, attachment will arise. When other causes and conditions are present, pride will arise. But they're all just different kind of variations, or different manifestations of fundamental ignorance, self-grasping, and self-cherishing. Any thoughts or questions on day 247? Okay. So then day 248, the quotation is, human problems can be solved by human wisdom, which again, like we've said before, that's the good news. So if Buddhists were to go around saying, have you heard the good news? We would say, did you know that your mind right now, the wisdom that it has, can be developed, can be grown, can be cultivated, and can overcome all of the problems. So it isn't like only some people have. Now, I mean, within a given, if a person, has some brain injury or something, it could be that, they may not have the ability in that particular lifetime, the way that their mind is being expressed through their body, given some sort of injury, could be maybe they really can't meditate. They really can't, um, to the same degree. And so it could be that maybe progress is a little bit more limited for that particular period of time. But, broadly speaking, if a person just has an average, sort of mental faculty, then it can be cultivated. And we can overcome ignorance by growing our wisdom over time. So he says, whatever exists is a manifestation of the mind. When the mind is covered with superstitions, here superstitions is, again, kind of another idiosyncratic way of talking about the false way that we the projections of the mind. Instead of relating to things as they are, we relate to things as fundamental ignorance misperceives them. That's superstition. It creates suffering. So when afflictions are present in the mind, we will inevitably suffer. Therefore, in order to gain release from this suffering, he says, it is important to understand both the characteristic nature of the deluded mind and the 6 factors causing these superstitions to arise and increase. Considering and meditating on these factors is so worthwhile. Our understanding can become so powerful that it makes our mind, he says, really straight. So, he just means, again, that we can fan the spark of our present wisdom, and by doing that, it will inevitably overcome, because the misapprehensions, the mental projections, they're false. They're not correctly understanding reality. They depend upon a mistake in order to exist. And so you can not engage with things in a mistaken way, and then like a mirage, the afflictions will just disappear, because they don't have reality as their base. They don't have a valid origin. They rely on being false. They rely on an untruth.
Venerable, I have a question, please.
Mhm.
Going back a few minutes, I'm sorry, the little hamsters don't turn the wheel quite as quickly in my head as they used to. Fundamental ignorance, comma, self-grasping, comma, self-cherishing, are self-grasping and self-cherishing manifestations of fundamental ignorance, or are they fundamental ignorance? In other words, do they comprise the totality of fundamental ignorance, or is there more to it than that?
So, because fundamental ignorance, so self-grasping and self-cherishing occur when fundamental ignorance apprehends the conventional I. The mind is also comprehending other things, things that are not the conventional body and mind, the conventional I. They're apprehending food and tables and chairs and things. But all apprehensions, all cognitions that are occurring in the mind of an ordinary person are equally afflicted by fundamental ignorance. And it just kind of happens that because, and I don't know if there's this isn't sort of a technical or scriptural kind of description, but seems to me like, because the mind is embodied, and because we have no choice but to engage through our senses, that kind of, and even in the bardo, there's a subtle body, and every form, has a body, whether it's an energetic body or a sort of flesh and blood. There is still this sort of perspective that we are inhabiting, and that and it's limited. We can only see and taste and touch, and within a range. um, it seems like in some way that kind of just gives rise to fundamental, or to self-grasping and self-cherishing. Like, when you eat food, it doesn't do anything for my hunger. When you drink water, it doesn't do anything for my thirst. I actually have to drink the water. I have to eat the food. And so, in a way, that we can only navigate the world through that kind of view. We're kind of limited in that way. And so it seems like there's a reason why, when you falsely reify or concretize the conventional body and mind into this false, self-sufficient, inherently existent, self-supporting kind of solid thing, this sort of monolithic ego identity that is owner of body and mind. And you combine that with kind of being embodied, and like, when you get hurt, I don't get hurt. I have to get hurt. If I break my hand, it's my hand that's broken, and that hurts. That's sending pain to my mind, and I'm apprehending that. And only when that happens does that happen. Some person next to me can break their hand, and you know so it seems like there's that combination just sort of empowers fundamental ignorance to give rise to self-grasping and self-cherishing. But then it is the fact that, but then other things come into play, like, the existence of, because like I say, also that dynamic, and again, I'm just explaining how this kind of seems to me. Just want to be clear that I'm not trying to teach the way, like some scriptural authority. When they say that we kind of divide things into pleasant and unpleasant, again, that seems to me related to being embodied in our, we have um, taste buds, and we have dopamine receptors, and so we can only, again, we kind of can only, and there's a biological, component, again, sort of an evolutionary biological kind of DNA aspect to that too, where like bitter things, they tend to be more so poisonous in some contexts, sweet things, and it's a source of like calories. Things that are sweet are generally more calorically. So there's all kinds of like hardwired things that we've inherited by being embodied in this way. So there are all kinds of reasons why we apprehend some things to be pleasant and some things to be unpleasant, like the smell of garbage. Very few people find the smell of garbage pleasant, whereas one person might prefer lilac, another person might prefer vanilla, but in terms of like garbage, that's a really protective thing, because you don't want to eat rotten food, right? And so there's these sort of hardwired things that because we are human, that we're kind of stuck with in a way. So I would say that an ordinary person who has self-grasping and self-cherishing is also interacting with phenomena, and fundamental ignorance is wreaking havoc not only with the creation of the ego identity, but also every time we meet with anything that's outside of ourselves, even if it's for the very first time, even if someone could invent something that we've never interacted with before. And in the next moment, fundamental ignorance is going to make up a story about that thing that's brand new to the world. Like cell phones didn't exist at some point, and then they did. Airplanes didn't exist, and then they did. And so fundamental ignorance is just constantly making up problematic ways of relating, false, concretized, reified ways of perceiving whatever it is that we're interacting with, which is happening in the mind of a person who has self-grasping and self-cherishing, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so Lama Yeshe is just saying, we can gain control of the mind, we can tamp down these afflicted states, and eventually we can see emptiness directly, non-conceptually, and we can join that with bodhicitta, and we can achieve full enlightenment. Okay. So day 249, and I do have to go right at 6:30 today. So I have a meeting, so I can't stay late. Not that I don't want to. I would much prefer, but I do have a meeting. So, the fundamental cause of the deluded mind is the karmic imprint left in our consciousness by previous non-virtuous actions. So he says deluded mind. So non-virtuous actions, deluded mind. So again, Venerable Rabina, often says, well, we have this tendency because we did it before. And that's all Lama Yeshe is saying. It's a habit. It's as sort of the phrasing that I've used, sort of the path of least resistance. It's a groove that we've worn into the mind. And so it exists because we've done it since beginningless time. We've had fundamental ignorance, we've had self-grasping, we've had self-cherishing, and therefore we've had deluded pride, we've had anger, and so we're really good at all of, falling into the tendencies and the habits of the afflicted states because they've all been with us, present in the mind, beginninglessly. So he says, let's say the thought of chocolate cake comes into our mind. Why does this thought of chocolate cake come? Because our previous experience of enjoying chocolate cake has left an imprint on our consciousness. The experience itself has disappeared completely, but the imprint remains, as if we'd sealed it and stamped it in our mind. As long as the stamp is there, the indestructible identification will be there. He says, it's the same whenever we psychologically experience anything, happiness, misery, anger, bliss. It is never lost. It is imprinted in our mind, programmed into our mental computer. It is always there. So because the mind is an unbroken continuity of mental moments, and we just don't have conscious, we've said in previous sessions that it is certainly possible. Many people, through developing single-pointed concentration, can recollect past lives. And the only reason we don't is because it's a really dramatic change in, the mind becomes incredibly subtle, and then it becomes gross again or coarse again, and then there's the birth, process. And it's a very incredibly dramatic process that the mind is going through, and that seems to cut off continuity of conscious memory for ordinary people. But those memories are accessible to people with single-pointed concentration. Not every past life at that moment, but a number of them become, and they say that faith in karma and so on becomes unshakable at that point, because they remember, they see the evolution of some fairly large number of past lives. They're not enlightened, even, of course. It's not even single-pointed concentration is not that exciting from, in the grand scheme of things. So you're very far, so you still have a lot of afflicted states. And so, of course, you have veils in the mind, but you get access to a number of immediate past lives. And then, of course, you see, well, this happened and then this happened. And so, you develop an unshakable confidence in the mind being beginningless and endless, and the law of cause and effect, and so on. And of course, the working of karma doesn't become, that's a super knowledge that's limited to enlightened beings. So I'm not saying that you trace each individual karmic action, but you generally see, I was here and then I was there, and I did this and then this happened, and so you get this sense of how the mind flows and evolves. Is what they say for a person who's developed single-pointed concentration. So that is the mind. The mind is that. The mind is this unbroken continuity of mental moments. And so that's why these karmic seeds, these tendencies, and these habits remain in the mind. And yeah. He says, still the memory of craving, desire superstition comes because it is imprinted on the mind, because we've worn these grooves, these tendencies, these habits in the mind. He says, when we understand that the experience of the chocolate cake arises interdependently, we can see that it has no self-entity, that it doesn't come from the object, it comes from our mental energy. We don't need too much explanation to see this. The imprint of the previous experience of chocolate cake is always there, whether we are awake, asleep, or meditating. Of course, there are cooperative causes too, the feeling of hunger, the arising of desire, and the object, the chocolate cake. All these come together, he says. We have to realize that the desirable chocolate cake is a complete hallucination. Objectively, it's not there. It's as if the imprint in our mind manifests into chocolate cake. So, so this is, again, getting at how fundamental ignorance relates to external objects. There is something there, there is form present. It's not as if Buddhism is asserting that objects are, the forms are not actual phenomena at all. But when we look at the chocolate cake and we look at the celery, and we desire one and not the other, and we imbue one with particular characteristics, and we imbue the other with different characteristics, that is all happening solely in the mind. That is all something that, and we can prove that because not everyone likes chocolate cake. For some people, it's too sweet. Or if a person had some sort of allergic reaction or even thought, or there's a phenomena where, like, getting sick, getting food poisoning causes aversion. So it could just be that in a particular chocolate cake, the eggs were bad. And so you got food poisoning, and now you associate the chocolate cake with the food poisoning, and for some time you have no interest in, maybe that memory fades, and like that doesn't, it's not a permanent phenomena, but even things that people enjoy, if they get sick, and it can even, I think it can even actually be like something else that you ate that, and then you ate the chocolate cake for dessert, but still, like, it kind of all blend, because it's again sort of a protective, response in the an evolutionarily adaptive response to avoiding things that might kill you. So that happens for a certain, and so if the chocolate cake really was desirable from its own side, then there couldn't be any difference in how one person viewed it versus how, because the view is coming from the object, and we would all be powerless. We feel, for us, for whatever those desirable objects are, we feel powerless. We feel as though it is the object broadcasting its desirability to our sense consciousnesses. But the fact that different people have different desirable objects, and they disagree about the nature of individual desirable objects, demonstrates that that's all only happening in each respective mind, and has nothing really essentially to do with whatever the object is. So there is a thing. It isn't, when he says hallucination, he isn't saying that we're all living in the matrix. I mean, in a way we are, but it's not like, it isn't like they are, that everything fully is unreal. But everything about the way that fundamental ignorance apprehends is unreal, is a hallucination. So the example that they give to kind of also demonstrate that is the way in which different sentient beings, because again, we just talked about how there's disagreement and so on. So if you look at the example of what we call water, they say that for the gods, the desire realm gods, they also can apprehend water, and for them it's this intrinsically blissful sort of nectar. But that's a karmic appearance for that particular being. And then they say that a hungry ghost, because they have a different karmic appearance of objects, they can apprehend water, and they see it as like pus. They see it as this disgusting, foul thing. And we are kind of like in between. Like sometimes if we're really thirsty in it, then it can be great. Other times we're like, oh, I can't drink anymore. I don't, like if we're trying to make ourselves drink more because somebody said it was healthy, and we're like, oh, I have to drink another cup of water. And it's like, so we're kind of in the middle between, like, sometimes it can be really good, sometimes it can be kind of aversive, but it's the same object for three different kinds of sentient beings. So the object isn't actually broadcasting anything. The object is the same, but the karmic appearance of the object for different sentient beings can be very different. And so it isn't intrinsically any of those things. It's not really any of those karmic appearances. Each individual karmic appearance is a hallucination, you could say, because it's only uniquely occurring in the mind of that sentient being. Even if every sentient being of a particular type would agree if you go to a different type and there's disagreement, then it's not actually valid to, from a logical, independent standpoint. Even if every single member of a class of, you could say, all humans view it this way, well, it doesn't matter, because not humans, it's just one type of sentient being. And so you can say conventionally, from a cultural linguistic standpoint, yeah, it makes sense to talk about it so that we can have systems of organizing ourselves, and we can make sense of the world and talk about things amongst ourselves and be productive and produce things and work together. That's all fine and good, but it doesn't get at reality in a real way, in a true way, just to say that every being even has the same view of something, which I'm not sure, I don't know that there is, and there may not be an actual example of that, because you'll always find someone who has, a defect in their senses, at least, and they can't taste something in the same way, or they can't see, their eyes, someone's colorblind, or so for them, they don't apprehend it, even if it's due to a physical, biological limitation. So there may not actually be an example of that, but if there were, it wouldn't be getting at reality. It would just be getting at conventional reality. Okay, so that'll be the last contemplation for today. Any final thoughts or questions or concerns?
Just a quick one, Venerable. You mentioned earlier that the imprints that we carry through are also part of how we survive in this world, that, that they've accumulated over lifetimes and been beneficial for us. And it made me think of the story you told, and I think Venerable Robina also talked about, I'm not sure I can remember his name, but as a young monk crossing a river and being in the middle of the moment of drowning and recognizing what was going on, and obviously saved himself. Because he had, excuse me, a different perception that was not caught up in the ego grasping or fundamental ignorance, that he was able to see it realistically?
Yeah, so that's Lama Zopa Rinpoche as a child, I think maybe not a child, but as a young person. I mean, it could be a child. I'm not exactly sure his age at the time. He was reasonably young, as I understand it. And I don't entirely know if he saved himself or if he happened to have been pulled out of the river. I think that might have been the case, that he was pulled from the river, because even the impulse, even the I mean, it depends. A person might realistically, as you're saying, a person might say, well, I have this particular incarnation. I'm connected to these ordinary sentient beings. It's helpful. That connection is really helpful for them. They are able to get guidance from this particular incarnation at this particular time. And so there's value in, like, pulling myself out of the river. For us, we do it because of fear, and because we would have this overriding panic. We would have this overriding sense of some really important ego identity becoming annihilated and being unable to tolerate that. And that's why we would try to get out of. But Lama Zopa, he said, the way that Venerable Urbanus, tells it, the thought that arose in his mind is the person labeled as Lama Zopa is dying, the person, or is drowning, or and so that was kind of what was going through. This sort of merely imputed person is experiencing potentially, their end. And then I think in the next moment he was grabbed and rescued, I think, but I wasn't there, or if I was, I don't remember. So yeah. But yeah. So the implication then is, even at, that Lama Yeshe or Lama Zopa came into this life having already realized emptiness directly, would be the implication of that. Because he's understood to have been a highly realized master. The Laudo Lama was the person that died, or and then so okay. Any last thoughts or questions? All right, so today's Thursday, and so we will pick it up again on Monday. So end with dedication. So we will recollect the altruistic intention that we established at the beginning. Think that by having listened and contemplated, we've actualized that motivation, generated positive energy in the mind. And that positive energy is something that we want to ripen in ways that serve spiritual, beneficial causes and conditions. So just strongly visualize that positive energy ripening in those spiritually supportive ways. Okay. So have a good weekend.
Have a
And
great meeting.
I will see you on Monday.
Have a
Thank
good
you.